I admit I'm not the biggest TED fan. I used to be back in the day, back when it was made up of credible scientists and businessmen who had something worthwhile to say and had the data to back it up. Today, especially with the TEDx system, almost anyone can say anything they want, no matter how cockamamie it might be, and try to ride the TED name to some degree of legitimacy. That's really where I'm going today as I take on a talk by Cammie Dunaway called Lessons for My Son.
I've got a confession to make. I have always wanted to be the mother of a daughter.
Well, we can see where this is going, can't we?
I think this goes back to when I was role-playing with my Barbies and my baby dolls growing up. I'm pretty sure that they only made female dolls in those days, so that's probably where the root of the bias came from.
At least you're willing to admit that you're biased, which will become painfully clear as we go on. But for the sake of accuracy, I'm going to make a couple of assumptions here. Now, Cammie doesn't look like she's that old, and she has a 16-year-old child. Therefore, I'm going to assume that she's in her late 30s, maybe early 40s. In that case, there most certainly were male dolls out there, most notably G.I. Joe, which came out in 1964. In fact, the original Ken doll in the Barbie line was introduced in 1961, followed by such male characters as Alan Sherwood, Brad, Curtis, Todd, and many more. The idea that there were no male dolls out there is ridiculous.
And this desire really intensified when I was learning about gender identity issues in women's studies classes at the University of Richmond.
Is anyone surprised? Seriously?
I decided that I wanted to be the role model for a girl. I really wanted to have a daughter so that I could help her build her self-esteem. I could help her build her confidence. And importantly, I really wanted to help a daughter learn how to succeed in what is still a predominantly male world of work. But as luck would have it, 16 years ago, I gave birth to my only child, a son, and after a little bit of consideration, I decided I wouldn't throw him back.
Yes, tragedy struck, and she had a boy, and we're all supposed to be happy that she didn't decide to kill him in her abject disappointment. This is really where it becomes obvious that this is going to become a feminist clusterfuck. For most people, they don't really care if they have a boy, they don't really care if they have a girl, they care if their child is healthy. I guess that's not true for people who spent most of their time in feminist studies classes.
And I'm glad I didn't, because he's actually turned out to be pretty kind and funny and smart. And I'm thinking now that he's made my life infinitely better, so perhaps he can also make life better for all of the women that he encounters along his way.
Because only women matter. This is something that crops up time and time again throughout this presentation. She is going to program her son to be a social justice warrior just like she is, to consider the rights and privileges of women to be much more important than the rights and privileges of men, because that's how she got indoctrinated. Notice she doesn't say that she's going to raise her son to be a good person to all. It's always to be kind and nice and supportive to women. That's all she cares about.
So what lessons do I owe a son? How can I teach him to be a colleague, a boss, a spouse who will really work to make the world better for women?
Because men just don't count. That's a running theme throughout this talk.
Now, I started thinking about this actually a few months ago. He was doing an assignment for his history class. They had a unit on the women's movement. And so the assignment was to interview someone in your family, a female in your family, about the challenges that they had had in life. So he says to me, Well, Mom, I guess it makes sense for me to interview Nana, who's his grandmom, because chances are she's had a lot more challenges than you have had because, those were in the older times. All right, there's some logic to that. If you go back to my son's great-grandmother, my grandmom, she was actually a secretary in a textile mill. And it was not a career. It actually wasn't even a choice. She simply had to work to pay the medical bills from a child who had died after a really lengthy hospital stay. And she and I never talked about it, and I regret that. But I imagine that if we had, that she probably had some pretty good stories of what it was like to be a secretary in a small town in the 1930s.
So your grandmother had a job, and that's a bad thing? You act like this is something that only women do. Everyone has responsibilities. We don't go to work because we want to. We go to earn money and be responsible for our families and for our lives. So why is it so bad that her grandmother had to work and not that her grandfather had to work? Because the only thing this speaker cares about are women. There's always some way to spin it so that women look like they have unfair disadvantages. Her grandmother wasn't forced to stay home and cook for her grandfather. She got out, she had a job, and it wasn't some manual labor job either. And suddenly, this is just a bad thing.
Now, my son's grandmother and I, my mom, we have talked about it. And I do know some of the very overt challenges that she faced. She was a minister of education in a church, and she had a male boss and male colleagues who felt that a woman, even a woman who had graduated summa cum laude from Wake Forest University, couldn't be allowed to handle a budget or to lead a meeting. Now, in my 25-year-plus career at companies like Frito-Lay, Yahoo, Nintendo, Kidzania, the challenges that I have faced have been less overt than that. But they've been every bit as real, and in some ways, I think they've been just as difficult because I've been trying to push further ahead in my career. But I've realized that until lately, I've been pretty hesitant to share those stories with my son. And I think that that's natural. As parents, we really don't like to tell you guys about painful and difficult things that we face. That's just natural. But I've started to wonder, is that really fair to my son? And importantly, is that really fair to the women that he's going to work with? To pretend like the battle's been fought and won, and to pretend like equality and meritocracy already exist today.
Likewise, your mother not only had a career, she had a college degree, yet somehow there are challenges that she faces. Of course, those challenges are almost entirely religious, not social. Now, I don't know for sure what her mother's job entailed. She didn't go into any detail. But I looked up what a minister of education was, particularly in the Baptist church, and found out that it's a high-end managerial position responsible for overseeing teachers and ministers for all educational matters in the church. It is also responsible for the care, upkeep, and repair of all church facilities. It helps set budgets for all aspects of the church and trains most staff in and around the church. That doesn't sound like a small job for anyone to have, yet Cammie complains that her mother, that person with the college degree, couldn't do anything. I see something of a problem there.
Change doesn't happen until you first realize that something is broken. And then you're much more likely to take action if somehow you personally feel impacted by what's broken. So if I want my son to be an advocate for women, I think maybe it starts with taking the time to tell him my stories.
Yet you're standing on a stage telling your stories to what I can only assume are elementary or high school students. And why would any rational person want your son to be an advocate only for women? Why not teach him about equality and egalitarianism? Clearly, she isn't interested in equality, as we'll see in a bit. She only wants women to get special rights and special treatment.
So my son knows, for example, that I graduated from Harvard with an MBA, and he has gone to reunions with me, and he's sat in that very intimidating HBS classroom. But I need him to know that of the 200 women in my graduating class, only 75% are still working full-time. And that compares to 95% of the men.
You will get very sick of the term, I need him to know. If she needs him to know, go tell him. She says it a lot, unfortunately. She also spends a lot of time asking questions that she clearly hasn't got the answer to. If 75% of females in her Harvard class are still working in their chosen field, as opposed to 95% of men, why might this be? Maybe the women made a personal choice to stop working full-time. One of the biggest problems with radical feminism is that they assume that any woman who doesn't do what they want them to do has no agency. They're being forced by the patriarchy to act in a manner contrary to their actual wishes and desires. It's all a bunch of absurd nonsense.
And I need him to know that that is not because those women were less ambitious. And it is certainly not because those women are less talented. But mostly because they found it too difficult to juggle the demands of a full-time career and family.
Because they make choices that you disagree with, and somehow they're wrong and you're right. Like many feminists, they declare what the proper course of action has to be, and any other decisions are not only incorrect, but the fault of men. Blaming men is always in there somewhere.
You know, my son knows that I've had the opportunity to work for some pretty cool companies. He has been to lots of take your kid to work days with me, and he's actually been very helpful on a lot of work projects that I've done. But I need him to know about how many times I've been the only woman in the meeting. And I need him to know how it felt to be asked to get the coffee or to take the notes, even when there were men who were a lot more junior than me in the room.
Then why didn't you say something? If it isn't your job, then by all means, correct them and get the proper person to do it. Stand up for yourself. She doesn't give any specifics here. Maybe she was just sitting next to the coffee pot. Who knows? We're meant to believe that this is all sexist, but without any evidence or context, why would we believe that it is?
And I need him to know how incredibly lonely it is to be the only woman at that business dinner and hear jokes and comments that are really inappropriate, and to not know how to respond in a way that doesn't make the situation even more uncomfortable.
This is actually very simple. Virtually all companies have a human resources department and specific rules against sexual harassment. You go to speak to an HR representative and file a complaint. Every single company out there, almost without exception, is going to immediately act on that complaint because they don't want to face a sexual harassment lawsuit. I've yet to work for a single company that doesn't treat sexual harassment as an immediate and important problem. The vast majority today have specific training sessions for employees so that the workplace is not unwelcoming. As for you being lonely, well, that's nobody's problem but your own, and only because you can only identify with other women. Apparently, your colleagues are there. You simply don't want to mingle with them because they're male.
Now, my son knows that as EVP of Sales and Marketing at Nintendo, I had the opportunity to present in front of thousands of people up on stage at E3. But I need him to know, as much as honestly I'd even like to forget about it, about the hundreds of hateful, misogynistic comments that were written about me online simply because I'm a female who is speaking in what is a dominantly male video game industry.
And where is her evidence for this? Now, I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but we need context in evaluating this claim. Was she the victim of internet trolling? Everybody is. Like it or not, there are trolls out there who get off on making people uncomfortable. They want people to react and get emotional. That's their entire purpose in existing. The more that you react, the more that you complain, the more trolls you are likely to attract. That's not sexist. That's reality. People have to deal with reality whether they like it or not. Time and time again throughout this video, we see that she overreacts and gets overly emotional to things that most people would either dismiss or not find worth dealing with. It comes off as a desire for special treatment, that women ought to be equal, yet still be treated differently because they're women.
Now, my son knows that I serve on a number of public boards, mainly because we eat at Red Robin a lot, and we shop pretty exclusively at Nordstrom. But I need him to know that only 17% of the 5,000 plus board seats in the S&P 500 are held by women, and that number really hasn't shifted much in the past decade.
And why is this? Because there aren't a lot of women who want to hold those seats? Or because of some vast patriarchal conspiracy that keeps them out? Apparently, you got to your position by hard work. Are you suggesting that other women are incapable of doing the same thing?
Now, like I'm sure all of you, most of his generation, my son absolutely appreciates how far women have come, but I need him to know how far there is left to go. My son absolutely believes in equality. He believes that women should have the same opportunities, that women should make the same pay for the same work. He believes that mothers can be as successful as fathers. He believes that everyone should be evaluated on their performance, that it should be a level playing field.
And it is a level playing field, no matter what you say. There is no significant gender pay gap. That's a lie spread by radical feminism that has been completely and totally discredited. This is also where she falls into the trap that often comes from the left, pretending that equality of opportunity is the same as equality of outcome. Women can do every bit as much as men in these career fields if they're willing to put in the same amount of effort as men do. The problem, as we've seen, is that she's looking for quotas, not equality. She wants equal representation, not equal opportunity. Any woman who wants to work in these fields can work in these fields, but there's always a trade-off. It might mean that you have to decide between motherhood and career. Sorry, that's just reality. There are only so many hours in the day. You might not be able to do both, especially in a home where both adults are working full-time. So you need to make a decision what is more important to you. If you can't do that, you're the problem.
And actually, that's a really great start. Research by Catalyst has shown that a strong belief in fair play is one of the leading indicators of how much a man will support women in the workplace. But I need my son to know that the playing field is far from level. And I want to inspire him to be the kind of man who will actively work to make it so.
Why isn't that a good way to treat all people, regardless of gender? Why does it always have to be women? Because that's all these feminists actually care about. Instead of saying that we ought to treat all people, regardless of gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, age, etc., the same way, she has to call out for special treatment for women in the name of equality. Special treatment and equality do not belong in the same sentence.
So along with raising his awareness through my stories, there are 3 lessons that I'd like to teach my son. The first is that I want him to be a colleague that encourages women around him, encourages them to speak up, to share their ideas, to go for it. This starts now in the classroom, and it'll continue in college and throughout his career. I want him to be like my friend Kirk Schroeder. Now in college, I studied really hard and I make good grades, but like a lot of women, I tended to underestimate myself, and so sometimes I just shot too low. It was Kirk who said to me, "Cammie, you got to run for student government. You got to apply for that internship, that scholarship that everyone wants." And you know what? When I won that election, when I got that scholarship, all of a sudden my confidence started to grow, and I started to aim higher. Now this confidence gap between men and women is really well documented. Let me just give you a simple example. If I share with you the notion of applying for a job, then research suggests that the average man, when looking at the list of job requirements, will say, "Awesome, I've got 3 out of 5. Wah, I'm a shoo-in." Whereas the woman, looking at that same list of requirements, is more likely to say, "I've only got 4 out of 5. There's no way they would ever choose me. I guess I better wait to apply for something that I'm more qualified for."
But isn't that your failure, though? Why should your son only tell women to be successful and try their hardest? Shouldn't that be something we push everyone to do? Self-confidence is a strong indicator of success, but the majority of self-confidence, obviously, comes from the self. You have to do it yourself. You have to feel it yourself. You have to work hard to achieve it yourself. If women have less self-confidence, then that is a failure of women, and they need to work harder to overcome it. I do find it funny that she even inflates women in her examples by saying that the man has 3 out of 5 criteria and the woman has 4 out of 5. It's just more feminist bias in the innate superiority of women at work.
When my son sees women around him underestimating themselves, I want him to encourage them. I want him to be the one to say, "You got to apply for that job. You got to go after that grant. You got to start that new business." Now, another way that this confidence gap shows up is in women's reluctance to speak up. And again, there's tons of research that documents this, but I think that we all observe it in the classroom and in the work environment. Women don't speak up, and what's worse is sometimes when they do, they're interrupted or they're ignored. My son can make a difference in this by being the kind of man who never interrupts a woman, never interrupts anyone, and who actively listens to them and encourages them to share their ideas.
No, when your son sees people around him underestimating themselves, he needs to encourage all of them, regardless of gender. Otherwise, he's being a sexist dick. If women can't speak up, just like if they can't have self-confidence, that shows a failure on a personal level. That's something people need to learn to do, men or women, in a business setting. If they cannot, then they don't belong at the big boys' table. Or big girls' table, if you want to call it that. I can assure you from personal experience that men talk over and interrupt each other all the time. Cammie seemingly only pays attention to women and thus has a very biased perspective. If she wants to teach her son something, maybe it ought to be politeness to all, not just to women. Although I think she realized for a second that she was laying the feminist rhetoric on pretty strong and slipped to mention polite behavior to all, and then never talked about it again.
Now, the second lesson that I want to teach my son is I want him to be a boss that champions women and mentors them. Now, male bosses have had a significant impact on my career. One of my first boss's longtime mentors, John Compton, was the one who championed aggressively to get me into my first general management position early in my career. And I was one of the first women in this position, and I came from a non-traditional marketing background rather than the more traditional sales background, so I wasn't an obvious choice at all. John had to stick his neck out to push me into the job. And you know what? I rewarded that risk by being the top performing general manager in the country both years that I was in the job. My first assignment to a public board of directors came because another influential male, Dusty McCoy, had the courage to say that he wanted a woman on his board of directors. Now, he didn't compromise at all on the requirements for the job. He demanded very rigorous functional expertise and experience, but he told his governing and nominating committee that he wanted them to push further to find a female in that role.
Why wouldn't he champion everyone and mentor everyone regardless of gender? I always push all of my employees to succeed and strive for the next rung on the ladder without a single thought about their gender, skin color, orientation, etc. It's not a good idea to say that Dusty McCoy pushed for a woman on the board of directors. That's a violation of civil rights laws that make it illegal to promote people based on their race, creed, religion, or gender. However, this is yet another place where feminist bias shows through. If her boss had insisted that a male be selected, she'd be screaming up a storm and discrimination lawsuits would be flying. Similarly, if they had demanded that only whites were under consideration, the social justice warriors would be freaking out. However, as long as it's a woman getting special consideration, they're all for it. Equality my ass.
Now, once women get into these leadership roles, it's really important that they get good feedback and good coaching. That same boss who pushed me into the general management role was great at giving me feedback. He told me what was good, and he told me what was not so good. And when he had some criticism to deliver, he didn't soft pedal it. He smacked me right between the eyes with it. But he did it in a way that I knew he cared about my success. And I also appreciated that he didn't mind when I shed a few tears in his office. He just kept the box of Kleenex right there, and he knew that that just came because I was emotional, because I was so passionate about doing well in the job, and that I would take that feedback and I would really use it to improve my performance.
I'm sorry, but you would never find a man being coddled this way. This is another case of special treatment for women just because they're women. It doesn't come from a desire to do a good job. It comes from being overly emotional and unable to control your behavior. Again, if you want to be equal, you don't get to be special.
The third lesson that I have for my son is that I want him to be a husband who supports his wife's professional dreams, both emotionally and with some elbow grease. And he has a great role model in this. My husband, his dad, has moved across the country with me 3 times for my career. He has been incredibly gracious when we've gone to sales conferences, my sales conferences, and he's been handed the spouse's itinerary with all of the spa treatments and complimentary fashion shows and makeovers circled. He was as incensed as I was when my son came home from elementary school, and not here, by the way, but came home with the flyer that was encouraging the dads to sign up for the Fathers, Come Talk About Your Career Week, and moms to sign up for the Mother's Tea. He also has done more than his fair share of school pickups and overseeing homework and loading the dishwasher.
But doesn't this go both ways? How many times has she moved across the country for her husband's career? I suspect 0. He's also put up with your sexist companies and not complained. I find it funny that you weren't incensed about that treatment as you claim your husband was over being invited to speak at your son's school. But yes, only so long as the discriminated party is a woman do you give a damn. When the situation is reversed, you couldn't care less.
65% of men who were surveyed recently said that they believed that caregiving responsibilities should be handled equally between spouses at home. But only 30% of them said that that was actually what was happening. For a woman to be able to bring her best self to work, she has to have help navigating all of the challenges outside of work. The babysitting, the doctor's appointments, the broken appliances, and those damn school bake sales. Actually, my son has a pretty good track record of bringing brownies to his school advisory group, so I think we're on the right track with that one.
Unfortunately, she's ignoring the potential reality. Are both parents in these relationships working equally? The majority of the work in the home will be done by the parent who is home most often. This is just common sense. I would ask where her evidence is, but we all know she hasn't got any.
So in closing, why is this important to me? Why do I think it should be important to you? Well, first, some of my most gratifying moments in life have been when I have been part of high-performance teams who have set big goals and made great things happen. I want that joy for my son. And he is far more likely to experience that if he is working as part of teams, working for companies where there's an equal balance of power between men and women. In a recent article in the New York Times by Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant, they shared that companies' performance is significantly better when there are more females in leadership positions. Where there is more gender diversity, companies have more sales, more market share, more customers, and more profits. And lastly, I honestly believe that if my son works to make the world better for women, then he will make the world better for everyone. It's not just the females. It is for that quiet male engineer who has awesome ideas, but whose voice is getting drowned out. It is for that young father who is committed to his job, but also wants to make a commitment to coach his daughter's softball team. It is for that male executive who doesn't want to move his family across the country every other year in order to achieve very ambitious career goals. We can get to that meritocracy, that equality that my son so passionately believes in. But only if he and all of you actively work to make that happen. Thank you.
Why is that important to you? Because you're indoctrinated radical feminist. Why else? And you don't want that joy for your son. You're telling him to push women ahead and not be part of a team. You want him to be a cheerleader specifically for women. If you wanted that for your son, you'd tell him to compete just as hard against women as he would against men. No egalitarian is going to demand an equal balance of power between men and women. They're going to want the best qualified people in the jobs without a moment's consideration for their gender. Gender doesn't matter. Job skills do. If it were true that the mere existence of women in leadership roles made a company better, why do only 5% of top companies have female CEOs? Currently, the Fortune 500 has 24 female CEOs out of 500 companies. This would seem to make her statement questionable. Maybe her son ought to be just concerned with making the world a better place for everyone without regard for gender. I also think it's funny that she brings up the male executive who doesn't want to move his family across the country every other year, when that's exactly what she asked her own husband to do. She clearly doesn't want a meritocracy. She only wants it for women. She couldn't care less about men. That's the thing about a meritocracy. It doesn't take gender or skin color or sexual orientation into account. It only matters what you can do, not what you are. And that clearly isn't what matters to radical feminists. Thanks for listening. I hope you look forward to my next video. If you have any constructive comments or criticisms, please put those in the bar below. Otherwise, thank you all, and I'll see you soon.